Greetings, it's Walter Hang at Toxics Targeting, and I'm very pleased to let activists know that we have gained more than 1,400 signatories to a landmark coalition letter which requests that Governor Cuomo require watershed Phase 1 environmental site assessments and mandatory total maximum daily load cleanup programs to essentially reverse the impairments in water bodies with harmful algal blooms all over New York. So people have wondered, what is a Phase 1 and what is a TMDL? So I've prepared this little presentation to try to educate activists about these issues, and if you have any questions, you can contact Toxics Targeting at 800-286-9427, and you can go to toxicstargeting.com and you can click on the harmful algal bloom link to see our maps and our data about cyanobacterial harmful algal blooms that have threatened drinking water for 9 million people in New York State. So as you can see from this map, there are about 150 algal blooms that were reported in New York in 2017. And all told in recent years, more than 340 cyanobacteria harmful algal blooms have been reported all over New York State. These include the Finger Lakes, New York City reservoirs, and literally water bodies from one end of the state to the other. The most important thing to recognize is that each of these harmful algal blooms essentially represents a governmental failure to enforce water quality protection standards. So the narrative water quality standard for nutrients which cause harmful algal blooms is extremely strict. Quote, none in amounts that will result in the growth of algae, weeds, and slimes that will impair the waters for their best usages, close quote. And most of these bodies of water have their best use as public water supply sources. So this has been an ongoing problem for years, and just recently the governor has announced a $65 million program to try to deal with the harmful algal blooms in only 12 bodies of water. And those water bodies are Chautauqua Lake, Canisius Lake, Honeoye Lake, Cayuga Lake, Skaneateles Lake, Owasco Lake, Lake Champlain at Port Henry, New York portion of Lake Champlain at Isle Lamont Watershed, Lake George, which has never had a harmful algal bloom reportedly, Lake Carmel, Putnam Lake, Monhegan Brook Watershed, and Palmer Lake. And I apologize if I've mispronounced any of these water body names. So essentially, the problem with this $65 million proposal is that many of the cleanup efforts will involve best management practices that are voluntary and 9-element plans so voluntary. And our coalition letter says that all of the harmful algal blooms, not just 12, but all of the water bodies with HAVs have to get a total maximum daily load. That's a mandatory watershed cleanup program. And essentially we're pushing very, very hard to make sure that Governor Cuomo does this and not just focus on 12 water bodies. In addition, his project is very, very limited in scope. It would really only involve some monitoring and some pilot scale projects. So it doesn't involve in any way a comprehensive cleanup. And that's what we need to prevent harmful algal blooms in New York. They're basically caused by excessive nutrients, notably phosphorus and nitrogen. So the only way to stop these harmful algal blooms is to reduce the amount of phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients entering these water bodies where they produce these harmful algal blooms. So I'd like to use Cayuga Lake as an example of how a comprehensive watershed phase 1 is required, and also how a TMDL is required. So you can see the southern portion of Cugal Lake has long been impaired by just incredibly huge infestations of aquatic weeds and algae. And we've been fighting this battle to clean up this lake for going on 20 years. So here you can see on an otherwise beautiful summer day, sediment is flowing into Cugal Lake through the inlet. And that sediment contains phosphorus. And phosphorus promotes the growth of algae and aquatic weeds. In many instances, this entire end of the lake will be like chocolate milk, with all the sediment flowing in from a series of impaired tributaries. You can see that there are accumulations of aquatic weeds and algae, even though the water is otherwise very, very clear. But due to excessive phosphorus, basically these weeds have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger over the course of years. You can see they've now engulfed portions of the southern end of the lake. So beginning almost 20 years ago, we discovered that the entire southern end of the lake actually exceeded New York State's 20 part per billion, a guideline for phosphorus to permit recreational use of the waters. So this whole southern end of the lake had too much phosphorus, and that's how come essentially it had too much algae and got infested with aquatic weeds every summer. And that's why in 2002, the southern end of Cugal Lake became a high priority for total maximum daily load development by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And this involved trying to clean up phosphorus, silt, and sediments from municipal wastewater discharges and non-point source pollution. But in 2018, we still don't have a TMDL, and the water quality impairments have gotten worse over the course of time. Now, the reason that this battle to clean up Cugal Lake got going is because Cornell University, circa 1998, wanted to build a lake source cooling facility which would suck up cold water from the bottom of Cugal Lake, but that water had naturally occurring soluble reactive phosphorus. And instead of returning that phosphorus-laden water to the bottom of the lake, they wanted to simply pass it through a heat exchange so that they could air condition their campus and then dump the water into the shallow southern end of the lake in 9 to 12 feet of water, where this was very, very likely, almost certain, to promote the growth of algae and aquatic weeds. So you can see in this New York Times article, Lanny Joyce said that lake source cooling would improve the water, but Andy Revkin reported, quote, "But an energetic group of local opponents insists that Cornell's $55 million plan to replace its aging air conditioners is actually an environmental nightmare. They say it could foster choking blooms of algae and bacteria at the south end of Cugal Lake, one of the fjord-like Finger Lakes created where glaciers scratched across New York during the last ice age," close quote. And that's exactly what happened. So in this pic you can see Patty and Joe Francis on the left. In the back is Rich DiPaolo, who's a town of Ithaca council rep, and then me and Marshall Ballard. So Marshall Ballard was a young scientist that I hired, and he walked nearly 30 miles of the impaired tributaries to the southern end of Cugal Lake. And every time he found a wastewater discharge, a stormwater discharge, an industrial discharge, he mapped it with a global positioning satellite unit within 1 meter accuracy. And then we overlaid this information on top of toxic targetings, environmental database coverage of landfills and hazardous waste sites, all designed to try to figure out where did the pollution in Cugal Lake originate. So for example, this is, believe it or not, the city of Ithaca reservoir, you can see it's almost completely filled with sediment. So these impoundments have a massive amount of sediment, and when this material washes into Cayuga Lake, it transports phosphorus into that impaired water body. You can see in the summertime, the excessive phosphorus promotes the massive growth of algae and weeds. And this just inundates the entire southern end of the lake. It's a massive infestation. And it obviously impairs boating, swimming, and also the drinking water drawn from the lake, because when this plant material basically degrades, it can cause pollution hazards for public drinking water supply. This is the shore right off of Stewart Park, which is a beautiful park looking up the lake, but you can see you couldn't swim or boat here. It's just completely filled with algae and weeds. And according to Cornell's own study, lake source cooling contributed soluble reactive phosphorus to the lake, and after the facility went online, chlorophyll A, you can see at site 7 in the southeast corner of the lake, went up more than 50%. And this is basically a measure of the plant growth in the lake. So lake source cooling violated the key provision of the Clean Water Act called 122.4 which said that no permit could be granted for a project that either through its construction or operation would cause water quality violations. And that's exactly what lake source cooling does. So in the summer of 2017, all of these excessive phosphorus problems finally resulted in huge harmful algal blooms in Cayuga Lake. They were just incredibly extensive, and this threatens the drinking water for more than 30,000 people, because when this cyanobacteria breaks down, it releases neurotoxins into the water, and this can make people sick and even potentially kill them. So for all of these reasons, Cayuga Lake still is supposed to be getting a TMDL. So this was reinforced in 2016, but 2 years later we still do not have a TMDL. And that's how come I'm going to talk to you about how a phase 1 environmental site assessment for this incredibly huge 500 square mile drainage basin is essential to identify where the pollution originates that eventually causes harmful algal blooms in the lake. So the only way to end harmful algal blooms in Cayuga Lake and other impaired water bodies is to somehow alleviate and eliminate the pollution sources in the watersheds. So in southern Cayuga Lake, both of the local wastewater treatment plants were upgraded, but that didn't eliminate the problem. Lake source cooling continues to discharge soluble reactive phosphorus, but that matter might soon be addressed. So the best example to see of what a TMDL, total maximum daily load, involves is to look at a TMDL that was required in June 2000 for the New York City watershed. And so you can see that this was supposed to deal with harmful algal blooms and other impairments in a wide variety of watersheds. But unfortunately, even though this did improve water quality, it could not prevent reported harmful algal blooms. Last summer in Croton Falls Reservoir, the New Croton Reservoir, and the Cannonsville Reservoir, and that's in the west of Hudson system. The Cannonsville Reservoir is part of the system that provides 90% of the drinking water for New York City. And this is basically the biggest unfiltered water supply in the nation. So essentially, as you can see, Section 303D of the Clean Water Act requires states to identify the water bodies in the state which, after application of technology-based effluent limitations required by the Act, do not meet water quality standards. These water bodies are identified as water quality limited, and the Clean Water Act requires the states to establish and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to approve total maximum daily loads, which upon implementation will achieve the water quality standards. And so the state of New York had identified the New York City watershed as priority waters for TMDL development circa 94, 96, 98, and ultimately in 2000 this TMDL basically was adopted. And so you can see a TMDL is the sum of the point source waste load allocation and the non-point source load allocations plus a margin of safety to account for the uncertainty in the relationship between pollution loads and the reservoir's water quality. So a point discharge would be, for example, a discharge from a wastewater treatment plant. And a non-point source of pollution would be, for example, sediment washing into a reservoir or a lake from upland forested areas or farmers' fields. And so in this instance, the TMDL addressed 108 point sources, including a wide variety of wastewater treatment plants. And these wastewater treatment plants were essentially improved so that they could curtail the amount of phosphorus that was being dumped into the various water bodies that basically became impaired. Now, the non-point source pollution control was not addressed as thoroughly, and that's a fundamental flaw of all of the TMDLs that have been adopted. They basically rely on best management practices that are voluntary, and they're not as comprehensive as they need to be. So all in all, you can see that this TMDL was very large scale. It basically required sewer extension, so you wouldn't have as much wastewater not being treated. They required upgrades and replacements of on-site wastewater treatment systems involving septic systems and leach fields and the like. They were trying to deal with stormwater issues. They tried to curtail sediment washing into tributaries from eroded stream banks. They tried to come up with alternative septic system designs. They tried to manage land use, all with the goal of trying to essentially alleviate and eliminate the contributions of pollution that cause water quality impairments. Now, this is a classic case of how in the watershed phase 1 environmental site assessments were undertaken to try to figure out where pollution originated. So you can see that a wide variety of sites are mapped and profiled, and then basically environmental professionals would go out into the field and they'd walk around and inspect these properties and try to figure out which ones were essentially recognized environmental conditions involving uncontrolled pollution releases. And so these phase 1 environmental site assessments are very, very common. They're two parts. One, look at the available environmental data to document pollution discharges, leaking tanks, all kinds of pollution releases that could be curtailed. And number two, conduct that field investigation so you can actually see what's going on, and then essentially develop an inventory of all of the pollution sources. So this is an overview of all the site categories that toxics targeting has compiled data for. And you can see the drainage basin, the watershed, has a huge array of known and potential toxic sites. We've already done an enormous amount of remedial work in the drainage basin for southern Cayuga Lake, thanks to the work that Marshall Ballard and Toxics Targeting did almost 20 years ago. But almost all of this pollution cleanup has involved toxics. So here we found massive lead contamination at Ithaca Falls. We've driven about $9 million worth of remedial effort. The work is not complete. This is the former factory site that was extensively contaminated. You can see there are electrical devices that were just literally laying on the ground. We recently persuaded the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to clean up the bottom area where a lot of the debris accumulated on the pathway to Ithaca Falls. That's Don Graham, the on-site EPA cleanup coordinator, along with Cynthia Brock, a Common Council representative in the city of Ithaca. So this was cleaned up, but then because the upper area was not cleaned up, it got recontaminated. So that's a continuing battle. This is a huge manufactured gas plant site that poses extensive contamination hazards. You can see it was a huge sprung structure that was established. It's about 120 feet long. It's 60 feet wide. And heavy equipment drove into this big tent-like structure and removed massively contaminated toxic dirt. You can see those front-end loaders ultimately dragged this giant structure all over the site, removing all of the pollution from the ground. You can see there were big doors. The heavy equipment would just literally drive in. You can see there's extensive air handling equipment to control the toxic fumes. You see that huge pneumatic hammer to drive sheet pile 53 feet into the ground to make sure that the pollution did not migrate into the adjoining residential community. Those big blue boxes are called Blue Magoos. They're portable groundwater treatment systems. You can see the sheet pile has been driven into this area where coal tar, which is cancer causing, was found in the yard of a residential home. You can see that one of the workers is spraying what's called biosol. This is to hold down the volatile cancer-causing agents, and a huge backhoe is digging up the polluted material. And they did this basically all over almost an entire city block, removing the documented pollution. They replaced the streets. They replaced all of the local utilities. You can see how close homes are to this contaminated area. And today, it's been remediated for the most part. It's actually a big ball field now. And you can see that orange fenced-in areas where the house used to be, and it was knocked down because of the high-level contamination. This manufactured gas plant site on West Court Street is not the only industrial polluted site in Ithaca. Recently, on March 3rd, the Ithaca Journal, the Press and Sun Bulletin, and the Star Gazette, thanks to Tom Wilbur, reported extensive contamination problems that had never been cleaned up in the southern tier and in the Finger Lakes. And one of the most egregious problems was this manufactured home park in Ithaca that is built on top of a toxic, contaminated, abandoned city dump. This is the only dump, I believe, in the state of New York where people live directly on top of the fill. And you can see there is a relief channel to the east of the site, and then the inlet is to the west of the site. And this area drains into Cayuga Lake, the source of drinking water for more than 30,000 people. So when big box retail structures were built at this site, the contractors ripped off the cover of the landfill, which was just dirt. It wasn't an engineered cover to prevent the intrusion of rain and snow, which generates toxic leachate. But you can see that literally thousands of crushed 55-gallon drums and industrial artifacts were revealed. And you can see to this very day, this landfill leaks like a sieve into this waterway. You can see the trailers, the manufactured homes in the background. And the amazing thing is, you can literally see additional 55-gallon drums that are strewn all over this site. It's just a shocking situation where the authorities refuse to close and cap and clean up this dump, even though it poses a threat to public health. And this manufactured home park has an illegal, non-code conforming water supply system that can get polluted by the toxics in the abandoned dump. So the same kind of visual inspection that can identify crushed 55-gallon drums and all kinds of toxic pollution problems, such as lead strewn on the ground at Ithaca Falls, can also identify pollution problems associated with phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients. So this is a classic situation where a farmer is spraying liquid manure on a field. This is to fertilize the growth of the crops. We have nothing against farmers. They're arguably New York's most important industry and economic undertaking, but there's no question that these kinds of farming practices can cause pollution problems if the manure gets into tributaries and finds its way into water bodies that can become impaired. So you can find these concentrated animal feeding lot operations that generate enormous wastewater problems. They simply have to be identified. If they exist in a watershed, they have to be assessed, and they can be cleaned up. They have to be cleaned up. So you can see there are these huge impoundments of liquid manure. The manure contains high levels of phosphorus and nitrogen and other nutrients, and if a big rainstorm comes along and floods this lagoon, that manure can find its way into nearby tributaries and can cause very extensive contamination problems. These kinds of algal blooms can be very, very obvious during the growing season. So an environmental professional systematically walking a watershed can basically see these sites and then identify them so that they can be assessed and cleaned up. The reason that a phase 1 has to be undertaken is because a field inspection is not enough. You have to look also at the available regulatory data. And so this is an example of a commercial vehicle. You can see that the cause of the spill is a traffic accident. It was never cleaned up to applicable standards. The material spilled is manure, 4,000 gallons, and the resource affected is surface water. And the caller remarks are simple, quote, "The trailer is leaking toward a body of water." Here's another recent spill also involving a traffic accident, does not meet cleanup standards. The material spilled is manure, 6,000 gallons, resource affected, surface water. Caller remark, quote, "Spilled to the creek from a rollover," close quote. Here's another manure spill in a creek. Basically 17,500 gallons of manure spilled to groundwater and surface water, does not meet cleanup standards. A C-clamp failed on a 10-inch pipe hose, resulting in the release of approximately 15,000 gallons of liquid manure to a tributary of Browns Creek. The creek flows behind a residential area between Chestnut Street and East York Road and continues east and enters the Genesee River approximately 3 miles from the village. The creek is very turbid and a strong manure odor is evident as it flows through the village, quote unquote. So in conclusion, a phase 1 environmental site assessment of an entire watershed can identify pollution sources, and those pollution sources can be required to be assessed and remediated as part of a total maximum daily load. This is a mandatory regulatory requirement, and you can see the failure to adopt TMDLs and the failure to assess water pollution sources throughout the state has resulted in a huge number of impaired water bodies. So we have nothing against farmers, we have nothing against anyone, but we have to know what the genesis of our harmful algal blooms are. We have to know where the pollution is so it can be curtailed. It has to be curtailed, otherwise our water impairments will never be solved. To learn more, please go to toxicstargeting.com, click on activist campaign summaries in the lower right-hand corner, and I encourage all activists who are concerned about harmful algal blooms that could impact their water supplies, their health, and their property values to sign the coalition letter, which requests that watershed phase 1s be required and TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, be adopted for all of the waters in New York State that have impairments. On March 26th, there will be, I believe, the last harmful algal bloom summit at SUNY Monroe Community College in Rochester. So if you have questions about your local lakes that might have impairments, contact Toxic Targeting, and we'll do our best to try to get you information that you can use to advocate for the cleanup of your local impaired water bodies. And I alert people living on Seneca Lake, Canandaigua Lake, and Keuka Lake, you're not part of the 12-lake proposed cleanup. So even those limited efforts are not going to be extended to your impaired water bodies. I urge everyone concerned about harmful algal blooms to call Governor Cuomo 518-474-8390 to request that your impaired water bodies be cleaned up so that harmful algal blooms do not threaten your health or your property values. Thank you very much.